Same setup as in the morning. We'll have Q&A after each talk. And then after the third talk, we'll move into a roundtable discussion. So we'll rearrange the room slightly and have a big discussion amongst everyone here. So first speaker is Marianne O'Donnell, whose name is not on the slide. Marianne O'Donnell is an artist ethnographer based out of Shenzhen. And in her work, she has sought alternative ways of inhabiting Shenzhen, the flagship of China's post-Mao economic reforms, which we've heard already about a little bit this morning. O'Donnell creates and contributes to projects that reconfigure and repurpose shared spaces, where our worlds mingle and collide, sometimes collapse, and often implode. Ongoing projects include her blog Shenzhen Noted and the Handshake 302 art space in Baishuzhou. In January 2017, the University of Chicago has published Learning from Shenzhen, China's post-Mao experiment from special zone to model city, which Marianne co-edited with Minnie Wong and Jonathan Buck, which is a fantastic book and I highly recommend. Her research has been published in positions East Asian Cultures Critique, TDR, the Drama Review, and the Hong Kong Journal of Cultural Studies. O'Donnell is currently co-director of the Handshake 302 art space in Baishuzhou, as already mentioned, and also director of public programs at the PNV Gallery in Dalang. And her talk today will be on dependent masculinities, bringing a gender perspective into our conversations today. So please join me in welcoming Marianne.
So this is what I'm going to say, basically. This is what I'm unpacking. That's it. So if you get, if you have that post-lunch exhaustion, you're just missing the details. This is the argument. So how border guards became IT colleagues in Shenzhen. And I'd really like to thank again the organizers for bringing me here and giving me this great chance to speak with y'all. It's been, so thank you Sylvia, Irina, and Robert, and everyone who's come and supported. Oh, it didn't? Yeah. Not on the thing. Okay. So this picture is most of y'all are aware that in 1898, after the Third Opium War, Great Britain took the new territories from what was the southern section of, at the time, Xin'an County. And that made the border at Shenzhen, which was a market on the northern side of the Shenzhen River. But it was actually beyond where the Shenzhen River ended and the actual earth met. So this is a really important picture for where I'm going. This was the first group of British and Chinese officials meeting in Shenzhen after the territory had already been given. And we were trying to figure out what are we going to do with this. So see all those Chinese and white man faces. Yep. There they are again, 1960. This was Life magazine. And the border is as militarized space, but it's actually, this is Zhongyingjie, which is China for England Street. And what it is, if we're seeing it this way, you're actually looking east. And on the Chinese side, you can tell it was a Hakka village. This is in the middle of where the land was and not the river was. But these impressions of the border as this contested space between Chinese and Western men, especially military men, was really important in how the border was presented. So this is the SEZ, and what you can see is right here, this blocked out space is actually a river, and the river goes to about here, and then it stops, and this part of the border is actually a land border. And so this is the railway, and the new territories, which are basically this section, is culturally integrated with this part of Shenzhen. It's Luohu and Futian up until Wutongshan. Wutongshan going east is, of course, Hakka, but from the mountains here and the mountains here up to about here, this area is Weito speakers, and they are culturally connected here. And there were about there were over 20 villages, but over 2,000 people who actually had claim to land and property on both sides of the border. And up until 1950, when the Korean War started, and it was decided that Hong Kong would not go back to China until the time was right, then the border gets militarized, and this is where this other militarization starts happening. So in 1985, this is just to give you a sense of the layout of manufacturing in Shenzhen, because this is really important. This is actually Luohu Shangbu. Shangbu was just a little thing. This is actually the area that's going to become Huaqiangbei. This was the Shenzhen City SEZ. This was the county seat of New Balance County, which was out here. The official industrial parks, there were only 6 or 7 of them at this time in Shenzhen, kind of over these red marks. But all of these symbols up here were the township and village enterprise factories that actually became the Shenzhen base of manufacturing. And you'll see that they're connected to the railway, and then going this way, the G107 highway. All of this kind of basic information I introduced yesterday, so we can unpack it later if you want to. I'm just setting it up this way. So who started coming into these factories? When Shenzhen is urbanizing, right? When industrial manufacturing becomes a means to urbanizing rural space, the factories were basically 70 to 90% of the line workers were female. It was a feminized space. You didn't actually, at the time, need your file to go with you. For those of y'all who are familiar with China, you know that to get jobs, your file moved around. Shenzhen, all you had to do was get to the factory. Often you had to give over your identity card because they would hold your identity card hostage, because often they didn't pay every month. You didn't get your salary every month. Sometimes they'd go 2, 3, 4 months without paying salary until the factories went on strike, and then the money would be given to you. So there's this whole history of factories not taking care of workers. And the more informal they were, the less likely they were to take care of their workers. Men became construction workers. They became truck drivers. They did the transportation. They did the import. They did the export. And one of the things, you get a sense of in these pictures is this kind of transition away from the Mao suits, and it kind of, at the time, these were the hippest people in China. All right. So this narrative of Shenzhen as factory of the world gets rewritten through 2 masculine figures. The first is memorialized as the agency of Deng Xiaoping as an enlightened leader. And the second, this is the character for Chua, which is a door and a horse running through it, but it's a virile young man. And so the spirit of Shenzhen, its creativity, its willingness to break through and transform, was conceptualized as this kind of a man breaking through a door. And so that very brief history that I just told you of the transformation of kind of this border relationship of Shenzhen becoming a site where Western capital could come and manufacture and produce when it came in, is rewritten as this history of enlightened leadership and this kind of creative masculinity. Even though the people actually making objects were by and large women. And so what were men doing? They were building construction. Will was talking about how even though construction workers earn more, the externalities were more damaging. They were more likely to have feet chopped off, hand chopped off, things like that, than women line workers were, which was part of the justification for giving less money, but also our nimble fingers. See how nimble my fingers are? And so that one of the really important things in all of this is that in terms of the logic of the border, we don't actually see, we see a straight narrative from a masculine border, a masculine militarized border into a border of masculine cooperation. We don't, and that narrative is, by and large, I would say the maker narrative, if I'm going to like bring it into this day. It's not unsurprising that today Xi Jinping, an enlightened cadre, is meeting with a somewhat broken and problematic entrepreneurs who is who's the president of the United States today, right? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates might be a more emblematic kind of entrepreneur, but this line of turning a militarized border into a collaboration between the Chinese state and Western capital, and this is all part of the Chao Ing-gan-mei, right? The surpassing and catch up to the United States narrative of Chinese development. And maybe I was thinking when Eric was talking, maybe the reason Shenzhen doesn't know where it's going is because it's caught up to the United States. The United States has no idea where it's going. Right? So now we're all in the same lost position. So what happens when we retell this story for gender? Hong Kong, as many of you all know, in the Qing Dynasty, prostitution was legal, selling young girls was legal. When the British came into and got Hong Kong in 1842, one of the conditions they got as part of the treaties was they were allowed to proselytize, and missionaries were allowed in. They had not been allowed in previously. And one of the first things that happened is venereal disease is criminalized, which is, of course, a way of going after women, the women prostitutes. And so that what happens in Hong Kong, at the time, in, of course, China, prostitution is not criminalized. Selling young girls is okay. There's all this happening. And this gets interpreted in Hong Kong as Chinese culture. At the same time, the missionaries push for the criminalization of prostitution, and they go after, but they do it through venereal disease and health. China, as part of its modernization movement, one of the things that happened in the 30s and 40s is any young women who were out working in the street, in a factory, in a silk factory, they were considered fair sexual game. And one of the most important things that the Communist Party did after 1949 was it brought women workers into the factory as a safe space. And they also they tried to rehabilitate prostitutes in these spaces. And so that this picture, which is part of that moment, this is the rehabilitation of prostitutes. And of course, they're happy in that socialist realism way. But Lisa Raffel has shown in her work that actually the factory workers in Hangzhou, whose factories went from being privately owned companies into state-owned industries, they were really happy because they went from being looked upon as prostitutes and loose women to being workers who contributed to the state. So that this is a very important background to seeing women in the factory in Shenzhen, right? So there you go. So at the same time that in China, prostitution and working women are being rehabilitated into people who can construct socialism and work for the state, English people and North American men are actually still playing with the idea of prostitution as a normal kind of state of being for Chinese women. And the whole world of Susie Wong, this famous bestseller, Passionate Torment Against the Background of Vice on the Hong Kong waterfront. Right? I mean, and as if these pictures couldn't be any more explicit for 1958. And although the 1958 play was the lead male, for those of you who care about Star Trek, was William Shatner, and he had hair. I almost put his picture up here, but it didn't actually fit as well. But So that while this militarization of the border is going on and Chinese-British relationships are being staged as a conflict between men, what is actually being staged in Hong Kong is the salvation of Chinese women. And from the point of view of Western men, they are saving them from the problems of China's culture. Right? We criminalized prostitution, China didn't. We, in Susie Wong, we marry them, we don't exploit them. And so that even as the Communist Party was doing the same kind of salvation of Chinese women by making them people who worked for and could construct the state, Western men were taking the idea that they are by nature prostitutes and then saving them through marriage. And art, they painted them. Okay. So these are from 1958, 1960 at the same time, the pictures of women working that were circulated in China and the idea of women workers building socialism. What's really interesting about this picture to the left is a decade earlier, maybe 15, 20 years earlier in the United States. You had the whole Rosie the Riveter, women were working very strong. And what was very important in the 1950s, of course, in the United States was to re-domesticate women so that men could go to work. And one of the ways we did that was by building houses that were too large to keep cleaned by one person, but not having maids. So like people like my mother took 2.5 days a week to clean my house when I was growing up. It was a clean house, but 2.5 days. And so even as the United States is kind of re-domesticating women, and British men in Hong Kong are saving Chinese women from prostitution, the Communist Party is showing women as working with men to build socialism. Was this the only story? No, of course not. But in comparing the pictures, one of the things that we see happening is that Chinese women and the role of women as workers was a highly contested subject in the Cold War, and how it played out at the Chinese-English border was very important for how Shenzhen is going to become a manufacturing hub. So this picture of outdoor karaoke in Shenzhen is because you can't just manufacture things, right? So in Shenzhen, now we've got this one very, like this history, but in Shenzhen you can't actually only work, even if you have forced overtime. You still can't be working all the time. And so one of the biggest issues in Shenzhen has been leisure. What do we do with leisure? What do we do with the leisure of young single people who do not have older people to take care of them? How do they have fun? And one of the earliest things to happen was called Dajiale, which was basically public karaoke. And so this picture of public karaoke, the structure of it, its composition is really important in what it tells us about this position of women in Shenzhen. Basically, women are out in public having fun with men, but the gaze is a completely masculine worker gaze. So that the male construction workers are actually positioned as the gaze that we are looking at leisure through. And so we have this sense in which space has been masculinized, and we talked about that yesterday through property ownership and whatnot, but also through labor is gendered. We've got women working inside spaces safe, right, in an enclosed space, and men working outside. And when women and men come out and to engage in different leisure activities, what we see happening is the gaze is masculine, and the women are protected inside between these two men. And here we have, this is from actually one of the play versions of Susie Wong. And you can see that it's the same kind of dynamic in which women having leisure in public spaces, they're always seen in the company of a man. And of course, this is in contrast to what was also happening at the time through Hong Kong and Taiwanese money coming in, the establishment of second wife villages, where Hong Kong and Taiwanese men were setting up mistresses in Shenzhen in specific villages, and basically re-sexualizing women who worked. And so that one of the things that's happening in the 80s and 90s is with this first stage with Chinese investment in the area is we're not only narrating this as the spirit of enlightened cadres and a kind of creative masculinity. This is part of that is part of is the re-sexualization, the re-domestication, and the in a sense, prostitutionalization of women. And when I arrived in Shenzhen in 1995, it was still the case that a young single woman could not walk alone after dinner, or it would be expected that she was some kind of sex worker, or if not a sex worker, that she was looking for a partner. And many of the large places you would go to, you could walk up through the door, you could pick the woman you wanted, or you'd walk in and they'd show you which woman would you like. And it was so prevalent, the sex industry in Shenzhen, and for basically Hong Kong and Taiwanese men at the time, that people would tell me what I should do is interview prostitutes. Because obviously that's what a woman researcher should do, and in retrospect I regret that I didn't. But there is this sense in which the first 2 decades of the Shenzhen experience it had 2 gender trajectories. One was realigning the relationship between Western men, and the other was repositioning Chinese women within national production. And you can actually kind of think of it if Beijing was the theory. Beijing in the 80s and 90s, you have all of these very famous women artists writing about love, right? Love should not be forgotten. All these love stories, in the recuperation of a personal interior life, that the stories were written about, basically Beijing, Shanghai. In Shenzhen, what came out of that was not the looking at interiority, but rather just kind of public sexuality and that kind of realization. So this aesthetic, this is from one of the urban villages. This is a picture from Gangxia before it got demolished. And this is, of course, Nancy Kwan in her pose for Susie Wong. And this kind of sexualized aesthetic crossed over very quickly into the border. And it was also the case that you could make more money as a sex worker than you could as a line worker. But it was also that many young women had pimps, many young women, and you could go to different parts of the city that were for Cantonese Hong Kong men, Cantonese speakers. There were parts of the city for Taiwanese speakers, Hakka speakers. There were parts of the city later on for English speakers. There were also French, Spanish speakers, so that the different parts of the city you could go to, you could find the kind of sexual service that you wanted. And you could actually ask people who were the best sugar daddies, and they would rank them by nationality, in the same way that people would rank which factories were the best to work at, right? So Hong Kong and Taiwanese factories were apparently horrible to work at because they were the most likely to run away and not pay their money. Japanese and German factories were very good. They were clean, they were pristine, they were precise. They paid when they said they were going to pay. Their forced overtime was, I guess, less forced. This was, of course, anecdotal, but this is all part of what was going on. Just see where I'm going. So, Western men start coming back into the scene around the late 1990s. At this time, what's happening with design is they start not just outsourcing manufacturing, but outsourcing things, higher level creative work, smoothing out lines in comic books, rendering movies. The higher end kind of, for finishing comic books, for finishing movies, for finishing printing. And so, because this is being outsourced to Shenzhen, and Shenzhen remains one of the top areas for high-quality book printing in the world, they sent over male managers to do this. One of the first men who came over was Guy Delis, and in 1997 he went to Shenzhen, and his job was basically to help a French animation firm. Guy Delis is from Montreal. And this is the cover of the book, Shenzhen. And that's basically the theme, you can say, of this kind of, after Chinese women have been resexualized through the introduction of Hong Kong and Taiwanese kind of second wife norms, and this kind of reintroduction of prostitution, white men finally show up into this mess. And this is his experience, poor white man lost in a crowd of Chinese faces. And he has the big nose. And it's like a space with no order, with lots and lots of women. Like, you can see how many women there are. And he has no idea where he's going, and he has no idea how any of the people relate to each other. And this is the cover of his book, Shenzhen. And this book was well received throughout the West. The New York Times, The Guardian, they all gave it positive reviews. And one of the reasons it was positively reviewed was because it was apparently very moving description of what it means to be bored in the grim frontiers of capitalism where you can't get a good cup of coffee. I have a quote of that in my papers. But the basic point was he was suffering, and he moaned about how hard his life was, and didn't really know. He moaned about how he couldn't engage with Shenzhen. He moaned about how he couldn't get good coffee in Shenzhen. He moaned about how hard it was to figure out and navigate Shenzhen. Didn't say anything meaningful about what work meant in the Chinese state, right? The idea that labor and industrialization was a way of pursuing national dreams. Didn't mention it. Did not mention the fact that Shenzhen was part of an interesting kind of trying to re-articulate the relationships between different parts of Greater China. So, I mean, part of the sexualization of Chinese women that Hong Kong and Taiwanese men engaged in the 80s and 90s was also allowing Chinese men to come together via the bodies of Chinese women. Right? That's also a very important, kind of like if you go back to Levi Strauss, and women circulate between men in order to build society. And we all know how much we hated that book. You can actually see in a kind of practical way the Chinese state allowing for the circulation of young women among different kinds of Chinese men and then foreign men in order to restructure the antagonism of a militarized order. So, Colby Bazell was a reporter from Esquire who was sent to Shenzhen in 2007. And he was famous because he wrote about his experiences in the Iraq War. And this is the picture that accompanied his article about Shenzhen. And just to give you a sense, I mean, I actually have less tolerance for Colby than I do for Guy, and I have no tolerance for Guy. So just to give you a sense of what Colby did, other than the fact that he really clearly enjoys portraying himself as a military person, going out and having adventures, this is what he did. Okay, so he wrote, this was the tagline. So, quote, if China is now the capital of rapacious, bloodthirsty capitalism, then that must make Shenzhen, a city of 11 million that didn't exist 20 years ago, the most bloodthirsty city on earth, but not without its charms. Close quote. Right? So on his trip to Shenzhen, Bazell, this is what he did. And it passed as a 9-page article in Esquire. And it was one of the first really big introductions to Shenzhen in North America after that book. I feel like, Bill Clinton, I never had sex with that woman. I never read that book. So here we go. He watched migrant construction workers and wondered when they would break out in a sweat. Quote, that was me. Mused about his vans being made in China, talked with white men in Shukou for insights into Shenzhen, compared the quality of his made-in-America bicycle with a made-in-Chinese bicycle he bought in Shenzhen, and then returned a Chinese person's hospitality by moaning about how much he disliked karaoke, which of course had been central to Shenzhen's kind of culture of trying to make strangers into friends. And so the first thing a Chinese person would do would bring you to go sing karaoke. And he went and moaned because, no white people songs. All right. And he did this publicly. He was so moaning publicly. Not surprisingly, Bazell visited what other white men told him was Working Girl Street, although these working girls were sex workers and not assembly line workers. The only person who was accorded respect in Bazell's article was a Chinese interlocutor who told him what he expected to hear. Most people don't know about Tiananmen, and Shenzhen people only care about money. So presumably, because Bazell knew what happened on June 4th, 1989, and cared about more than making money, his image, he was thus qualified to write about the city. Significantly, in Bazell's article, and this is the same in Shenzhen's book, sarcasm is a rhetorical device that simultaneously asserted the author's superiority and excused him from learning about the city through more conventional routes. Why should he bother interviewing local historians, reading published materials about the city, arranging a visit to its factories, and hiring a qualified interpreter to talk with residents when the city was so obviously beneath his contempt? And this was the standard of reporting on Shenzhen. And so what we see happening here, as much as in Hong Kong, where the militarization of society then gets finessed through debates about are women prostitutes or not, which is basically how English and Chinese officials navigated the whole Hong Kong condition. We see that the resexualization of Chinese women that allowed for Greater China to come together in producing in Shenzhen then becomes the vehicle through which white men are able to enter into and start collaborating with Chinese men in manufacturing. I mean, that was the illustration for his article on Shenzhen.
It's not his collage.
What?
It's some artist's collage.
It's somebody. Yes, it's another artist's collage,
Esquire.
but from Esquire. But they chose this kind of sexualization of women as the means to bringing men into the city. And there were no pictures of the city. Yeah, there's a
Some
pan.
buildings.
And there's Starbucks because he wanted Starbucks to be there and it wasn't in 2007. It's a huge issue. All right, so that part of what we've traced by the time we get to, how do women now appear? In 2010, so 1996 until 2010, is this time when Shenzhen, nobody knows what's going to happen to Shenzhen. It's been abandoned by the central state because Jiang Zemin is reinvesting everything into Shanghai. And basically the 1996 to 2010 master plan doesn't do anything. It continues to build infrastructure, but basically society at large is ignored. So this is the time when Huaqiangbei becomes really big into Shanzai, and all these things start happening because there's actually no regulation happening on the ground because people thought Shenzhen was going to die. So out of this moment, it soon becomes recognized that manufacturing in electronics are going to be very important. And this is Shirley Feng. So Feng Zhanghong, who was one of the most important people pushing for. Yeah, she was, and she has a better haircut now, right? But she was actually really important in bringing China's national leaders to Shenzhen to get them interested in the possibilities that electronics would provide for the city. And so here she is showing Li Changqu, Shenzhen, and national leader from Beijing, very, very important. And all of these, And what's really interesting in the actual putting together of this image is, what are we looking at again? One woman in a sea of men. One safe woman in an environment that is... So that the aesthetics of this transformation of space continues into the representation of political power as well as its actual working. And so that...
Because I think people at the back cannot see the sign.
The caption.
Oh, Shenzhen Industrial Design Association Secretary General Shirley Feng introduces Standing Committee member Li Changchun to the ideas of human-centered design, listening, discussing, foreseeing, and thinking. This is 2010 when Shenzhen starts its new urban plan, its new city plan, which is actually where we begin to see the city that all of us are here today talking about. And she was really important, and she is not present in the discourse in really important ways. This is Tim Cook visiting Foxconn in 2014. And one of the things that we see here again, we're still female workers, and they're laughing together, and we can actually see Tim Cook, and he's actually named. And the pretty technology makes it hard to see the woman. So in the same way that when Shirley is showing Li Changchun the city and its technology, we stop looking at her and we look at the technology and the city's potential. In the same way, you walk into a Foxconn factory, you don't see all the women workers, you see the pretty iPhone. So, hello, Eric. See, this is the picture. When we do see pictures of collaboration between white men and Chinese men in the maker scene, it's always two men. We very rarely see two. I've never seen a picture of two women in the Chinese maker scene being celebrated as a symbol of this. And apparently he's also famous, Massimo Banzi, but since I don't do makers, right? And this is actually also kind of fun for those of you who know Chinese. Massimo is actually on the women's side. And this is actually really important. So that this is the kind of actual way that we're seeing women coming and then approaching technology in Shenzhen. One, where technology is enhancing your masculinity, so you become a big transformer. And for women, it's enhancing your femininity, so you can't walk. So then this is the iconic image of how the border gets negotiated, right? Deng and Margaret Thatcher coming together. And if you go and you see the original picture of this that was taken in 1985, you'll see actually sitting right here are two female translators. And so the work of the women who translated for the meeting and made it possible for them to talk to each other is also can be ignored because our gaze is directed to the new border, the new collaboration. And this was on the door, my door, for Chinese New Year. So here is the man holding his renminbi, and here is the newest woman holding her Benjamin Franklin. And what we have here is this perfect kind of realization of the way border guards became collaborators. It's through actually a certain kind of economic productivity for women in a sea of men. Right? This is the good wife with Ben and Mao and little boy. Right? And so that even in this kind of a picture, it's still one woman with many men. And that's how we know she's a good girl and not a prostitute. So anyway, this is me. The basic argument has been that originally it was a militarized, masculinized border. In Hong Kong, men, the role of whether or not Chinese women were prostitutes allowed for Chinese men and Western men to argue over rights to the city, the moral rights to the city through saving Chinese women from prostitution. At the same time that the Chinese state actually did that, and then in order to get Taiwanese and Hong Kong capital back in and to remake Greater China through the one country, two systems policy, they actually allowed for prostitution and sexualization in Shenzhen, which was not at all regulated. It was everywhere. It was actually across the street from the city government. It was everywhere. And they allowed it to happen because it actually cemented relationship between men. And by the time Western men came into this, they started again having girlfriends and saving Chinese women from Chinese culture. And the good Chinese woman is always surrounded by these men in these particular ways. And so you need this gender reading and able to get this kind of genealogy of the maker movement and why Shenzhen has been so important in transforming practical relations on the ground as China becomes the center of the world. If you have WeChat, you can connect to me.
We have time for maybe one or two quick questions.
Well, of course, this gender perspective is immensely wide and requires a lot of knowledge. But just maybe briefly, I have actually no idea how it's structured in China. It's pretty close on that stuff. It seems that the principle of monogamy is quite strong there, right? Because we have many deviations from it in other cultural regions. And also, I don't know, relation to homosexuality, you did mention it. Could you kind of, I don't know, this is a really big question.
I don't know that monogamy is the point so much as staying married is the point. I think that staying married is really, really, really important. And getting divorced, I mean, the divorce laws in China are pretty, it's like anywhere. It's actually easier to get married than it is to get divorced, right? And it should actually be the reverse, right? Make it really difficult for people to get married and then get divorced, why not? So that kind of extramarital affair is very common. Marriage for most, as far as I know from many of my gay friends, the point isn't the marriage, it's the children. One of the 3 great crimes you can commit against your parents is not to have a child. And everyone I know who's a functioning moral adult has children. I'm not a functioning moral adult. But, and so it's actually staying married which is important, and not so much the permeations of that.
And where's coming from? Like from
No, monogamy actually comes in, I think, through the missionaries into South China and the whole moralization of family life that the Christians brought in with colonialism. China had the high wife was the good wife, and then you had different levels of wife that had different kinds of official status. And what has always been really important is your status. Are you the big wife? Are you a little wife? Are you an outside in the street kind of person? And I think that the reason it works so well is that neither system, neither the Christian colonial system nor the Chinese Confucian system, actually worked for women. And it was a point of agreement between men who had nothing else they agreed on. And, right? And I mean, I think that was very much the case during the 80s and 90s when the second wife villages were coming up. That men who couldn't otherwise talk to each other, they would go to karaoke bars, and if they could afford sanpei, if they could afford escorts, right? They had women who sang with them, women who ate with them, women who danced with them. And then, it was really hard to find a hair salon that was actually cutting hair. And all of this complete sexualization of the environment was pretty much gone. 2006 was the massive sex cleanup, where they were actually publicly displaying sex workers in ways reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. Again, it was the criminalization of the women rather than the men. And they were publicly paraded. This was 2006 in Shadzui. And this huge anti-sex kind of thing. So that by the time in 2010, when the kickoff into technology starts, Shenzhen is cleaned up and looks very middle class. And so that In a lot of ways, the new tech workers who are coming in came in after all of this sexualization had happened. And they kind of take it for granted that middle-class women values are less than men, but they didn't actually see the on-the-ground 25 years through which women were every day sexualized as a means of doing business. I mean, Xiaoming Hu, every weekend, Hong Kong men, Chinese women. Xi Li was more Chinese men, Chinese women. Like these major resort areas that get promoted as Shenzhen's tourist industry during the 80s and 90s, they were effectively and knowingly on the part of the government, they were sex places. They were sex resorts for businessmen.
Okay, can you go and set up your slide?
Yeah.
Is there a last question for Marianne as Sergey sets up? A quick one? Yeah.
I guess my question will not be a quick one. I like the way you connect geopolitics with the reading of gender and sexuality. But I'm just wondering this kind of grand narrative, because you give a very sweeping generalization about the sexualization of women in Shenzhen, and probably in China in general after the open and reform policy. I just don't feel very comfortable with this kind of generalization, because a lot of details are kind of lost in this generalization. For example, if you look at the mass media, the representation of those dagume, it's not just sexualization. There's a lot more into it. And for example, the early television female migrant workers in Guangdong area, in Shenzhen, dagume. You look at that TV series, it's not just about sex. It's about women's struggle. Those women who leave their hometown, who try to build a new life, who want to find love, romance, and also they want to, to gain a kind of new sense of agency in the city. So all those kind of things, you cannot be just simply categorize as a kind of sexualization.
It's part of it, though, I would say, because the search for love is the fantasy that emotions will save you from sexualization, right? This is one of the really sad things about romance as it stands, is that it's the fantasy that if a man loves me, he won't treat me like a prostitute. And if you look at Dagume, if you look at that Dianzhiju, what do you see happening? There's a good man who treats you through affection, through love, and then there are the bad men who treat you as a kind of sexualized object. I think that in general there were a lot of women who went with different dreams. I think a lot of my friends really wanted to do different things, and I agree with that. But on the ground in Shenzhen, during the 1980s and the 90s, you constantly heard stories about rapes happening in the dormitories, where if it was a mixed dormitory, male workers would walk into rooms and rape women who were in there. It's not that this was every single woman, but it was so common that women did not walk alone after dinner. It was so common that I have a friend who's a writer who came from Dongbei, moved to Bao'an, and 2 days after she arrived, she stopped wearing makeup. Because when she was wearing makeup in 1994 in Shenzhen, men assumed she was a prostitute. That's how common it was.
I have heard. I think I'm afraid we have to cut it off. We have lots of time for discussion later, so thank you again, Marianne.